I never expected my heart to pound this hard as I stood outside the Thompson family's front door. My hands were shaking, but not from nerves about meeting Alex's parents. No, I was shaking because I was about to walk into the biggest test of my life, dressed like someone I wasn't, pretending to be poor when I made more money in a month than most people see in a year. The cheap polyester dress I bought from a discount store felt scratchy against my skin. I had spent hours at thrift shops finding the perfect outfit, something that screamed struggling without being too obvious. My usual designer clothes were hanging safely in my penthouse closet, 20 miles away from the modest apartment Alex thought I lived in. When the door opened, Margaret Thompson's eyes swept over me like a scanner at airport security. Her smile was plastic, the kind rich people give to service workers. "You must be Natalie," she said, but her tone suggested she wished I wasn't. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for inviting me," I replied, making my voice smaller and more uncertain than usual. I had practiced this act for weeks. As I stepped inside, I heard her whisper to her husband, "Alex said she was simple, but I didn't expect quite this level of simplicity." The word dripped with disgust. My chest tightened. Simple? Is that how Alex described me to his family? Robert Thompson stood behind his wife, and something strange happened when our eyes met. He stared at me for a long moment, longer than politeness would suggest. His brow furrowed like he was trying to solve a puzzle. I felt exposed, like he could see through my carefully constructed disguise. "Welcome to our home," he said quietly, still studying my face. "Thank you, sir. You have a beautiful house," I managed, looking around at their obviously expensive furniture and artwork. It was nice, but nothing compared to my own place. My penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, original paintings worth more than their car, and a kitchen that cost more than most people's annual salary. But they didn't know that. Nobody knew that except Caroline, my best friend, who had begged me not to go through with this charade. "Natalie!" Alex appeared, wrapping his arms around me. "You look nice," he said, but I caught the slight hesitation. Even he seemed embarrassed by my appearance. Jessica, Alex's sister, bounced down the stairs wearing a dress that probably cost more than I was pretending to make in a month. "So, you're the famous girlfriend we've heard so much about?" she said, her eyes taking in every detail of my outfit with barely concealed amusement. "I hope Alex has said good things," I replied, playing the part of the nervous girlfriend meeting the family for the first time. "Oh, he's told us plenty," Margaret said with a tight smile. "Come, let's sit down for dinner. I'm sure you're hungry." The way she said hungry made it sound like she thought I hadn't eaten in days. As we walked to the dining room, I caught fragments of whispered conversations. Didn't expect her to be so. Alex could do so much better. What does he see in her? Each word was like a small knife. These people were judging me based on my clothes, my fake story about working part-time as a receptionist, my pretend financial struggles. They had no idea that I owned 3 cars, that I had more money in my checking account than they probably had in their retirement funds, that I had built my wealth through my own intelligence and hard work. But that was exactly the point. I needed to see who Alex really was, and more importantly, who his family was. I needed to know if the man I was planning to marry would stand by me if I truly had nothing, or if he was just another person who valued money over character. The dining room was set with their good china, but I noticed Margaret had given me the only chipped plate. A small detail, but it spoke volumes. "So, Natalie," Margaret began as we sat down, "Alex tells us you work part-time. That must be challenging financially." "I manage," I said quietly, cutting into the chicken that was probably worth more than my fake weekly salary. "I'm sure you do," Jessica chimed in. "But don't you want more for yourself? I mean, don't you have bigger dreams?" If only she knew. If only any of them knew that I had already achieved more than they could imagine. That while they were sitting here judging me for my fake poverty, I was mentally calculating how their combined net worth still wouldn't match my annual income. Robert continued to watch me throughout dinner, his expression growing more puzzled by the minute. Something about his stare made me uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with my disguise. "Tell us about your family," he said suddenly, interrupting his wife's lecture about realistic expectations for people in your situation. My parents both passed away, I said, which was true. I don't have much family left. His face went completely white. 3 weeks earlier, I sat in my penthouse office, staring at the city's skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's cars. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, living in luxury while planning to pretend I had nothing. "You're absolutely insane," Caroline said, pacing across my marble floors in her designer heels. "This whole plan is going to blow up in your face." I spun around in my leather chair, the one that cost $8,000 and was worth every penny for the long coding sessions that built my fortune. "I need to know, Caroline. I need to know if Alex loves me or just the idea of me. But lying about your entire life? Natalie, you make $50,000 a month. You own this penthouse, that ridiculous car collection in the garage, and enough stock options to buy a small country. How long do you think you can keep pretending to be poor?" She was right, of course, but I had learned the hard way that money changed everything. When people knew about my wealth, they treated me differently. They wanted things from me, expected things, assumed things about who I was based on my bank account. That's why I had been so careful with Alex from the very beginning. I met him 6 months ago at a small coffee shop downtown, the kind of place I went to when I wanted to feel normal. I had deliberately dressed down that day, jeans from a regular store, a simple sweater, no jewelry except my grandmother's modest ring. When Alex spilled coffee on my laptop, he was mortified. "I'm so sorry. Is it ruined? I'll pay for repairs. I promise," he had said, frantically grabbing napkins. "It's okay," I had laughed. "It's just an old laptop anyway." The old laptop was actually a custom-built machine worth more than his monthly salary. But he didn't need to know that. He insisted on buying me a new coffee, and we ended up talking for 3 hours. He was charming, funny, and refreshingly honest about his life. He worked in marketing for a mid-sized company, lived in a decent apartment, and had normal problems like student loans and saving up for a better car. For the first time in years, someone was talking to me like I was just a regular person. So I became one. I rented a small apartment across town, furnished it with budget furniture, and created an entire fake life. I told Alex I worked part-time as a receptionist, that I was between careers, that money was tight, but I was managing. I bought clothes from discount stores, learned to shop at budget grocery stores, and practiced living like someone who actually worried about money. The hardest part was leaving my penthouse every morning to go to my fake apartment before Alex picked me up for dates. I would drive my modest Honda, the cheapest car in my collection, and park it outside the building where I supposedly lived. Then I would change clothes in the car, switching from my real life to my pretend one. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Caroline had asked during one of our weekly lunches at an expensive restaurant I had to pretend I couldn't afford when I was with Alex. "Because I want to know if he would love me if I had nothing," I explained. "Every other guy I've dated, once they found out about my money, everything changed. They either wanted me to pay for everything, or they felt intimidated and pulled away, or they started seeing dollar signs instead of me. But Alex seems different." They all seemed different at first. The truth was, my money had been both a blessing and a curse. I had earned every penny through my work in software development, building applications that companies paid millions to license. I was proud of my success, but it had cost me in other ways. Friends who suddenly needed loans they couldn't repay. Boyfriends who expected expensive gifts and lavish vacations. Family members who came out of nowhere when they heard about my success. After my parents died, I realized how alone I really was. Money couldn't buy genuine relationships, and it certainly couldn't bring back the people who loved me before I had anything to give. That's why Alex felt like such a gift. For 6 months, he had loved the version of me that struggled to pay rent, that suggested cheap restaurants and free activities, that wore the same dress to multiple events because I couldn't afford new clothes. He never made me feel bad about my supposed financial situation. He was patient, kind, and never pressured me to spend money I supposedly didn't have. But now came the real test. Meeting his family would show me who Alex really was when other people were watching. Would he defend me if his family looked down on my fake poverty? Would he be embarrassed by me? Would he show his true colors when faced with their judgment? Just promise me, Caroline said, as I prepared for the dinner, that if this goes badly, you'll tell him the truth instead of just disappearing. I had promised, but as I sat in that dining room watching his family tear me apart while he said nothing, I wasn't sure the truth would matter anymore. The chicken on my plate grew cold as Margaret Thompson continued her assault, disguised as polite conversation. Each bite felt like swallowing glass while I maintained my act of being the struggling girlfriend who was grateful just to be included. "So, Natalie," Margaret said, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin that probably cost more than my fake weekly salary, "a part-time receptionist position must be quite limiting. Have you considered going back to school? Perhaps learning a trade?" The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. I forced a small smile. "I've thought about it, but school is expensive. I'm just trying to get by right now." Jessica snorted into her wine glass. "Get by? That's no way to live. I mean, look at that dress." She gestured at my deliberately cheap outfit with barely concealed disgust. "When was the last time you bought something new?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from pure rage. In my real closet hung dresses worth more than Jessica's car payment. I owned shoes that cost more than her monthly shopping budget. But here I sat, being lectured by a spoiled 24-year-old who had never worked a day in her life. "Jessica," Alex said weakly, "that's not really appropriate." "What?" "I'm just saying she could make more of an effort. I mean, you're bringing her to meet us. Doesn't she want to make a good impression?" Margaret nodded approvingly at her daughter's cruelty. "Jessica has a point, dear. Presentation matters. It shows respect for the occasion and for the people you're meeting." I gripped my fork tighter, imagining what their faces would look like if I told them about my penthouse, my car collection, my stock portfolio that grew by thousands every day. Instead, I played my part. "I'm sorry if my appearance is disappointing," I said quietly. "This is actually my nicest dress." The lie tasted bitter, but their reactions were exactly what I expected. Margaret's eyebrows shot up in horror. Jessica actually gasped. And Robert was still staring at me with that strange, puzzled expression. "Oh, honey," Margaret said in a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We're not trying to be mean. We just want what's best for Alex. Surely you can understand that." "Of course," I replied, wondering how Alex could sit there and let his mother talk to me like I was a charity case. "The thing is," Margaret continued, warming up to her topic, "Alex has always been ambitious. He has goals, plans for his future. He needs a partner who can support those dreams, not hold him back." The implication was crystal clear. I was the anchor dragging Alex down into poverty. "Mom," Alex said, but his protest was half-hearted at best. He looked uncomfortable, but not angry, embarrassed, but not defensive. "I'm just being honest," Margaret replied. "Alex deserves someone who can contribute to their future together, someone who shares his values and his level of success." Jessica leaned forward eagerly. "Remember Alex's ex-girlfriend, Amanda? Now she was perfect for you. Her father owns that chain of restaurants, and she had such style. Remember that gorgeous dress she wore to Cousin Michael's wedding? Amanda was lovely." Margaret agreed. So sophisticated, so well-educated, and her family had such wonderful connections. I watched Alex's face as they praised his ex-girlfriend. He didn't defend me, didn't tell them to stop comparing me to Amanda, didn't point out how cruel they were being. He just sat there, occasionally nodding along with their comments. "What happened to Amanda anyway?" Jessica asked innocently. "You two seemed so perfect together." "We just grew apart," Alex mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Such a shame," Margaret sighed. "She would have been such an asset to the family." Asset. Like a business acquisition rather than a human being. Robert finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. "What did you say your last name was again, Natalie?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "Brooks," I answered, confused by his sudden interest. His face went even paler. "And where did you grow up?" "Millfield," I said, naming the small town where I had actually spent my childhood. "It's about 2 hours north of here." Robert's fork clattered against his plate. Margaret looked at him with concern. "Robert, are you feeling all right?" Fine, he said quickly, but his hands were shaking slightly. Just Millfield. I used to know someone from there. Something cold settled in my stomach. The way he was looking at me now wasn't just puzzled. It was recognition, mixed with something that looked like fear. Small world, I said carefully, watching his reaction. Yes, he whispered. Very small. Margaret, oblivious to the sudden tension, continued her attack. Well, regardless of where you're from, dear, you need to think about your future. Alex is going places, and he needs someone who can keep up. But I barely heard her anymore. All my attention was focused on Robert Thompson, who was staring at me like he had seen a ghost. The atmosphere at the dinner table had shifted dramatically. While Margaret and Jessica continued their relentless assault on my character and appearance, Robert sat frozen, his face growing paler by the minute. Something about my hometown had triggered a reaction in him that went far beyond polite recognition. You know, Natalie, Margaret said, cutting into her perfectly prepared salmon, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but have you considered that you might be holding Alex back? A man needs a partner who can elevate him, not someone who… Mom, please, Alex interrupted, but his voice lacked any real conviction. He was embarrassed, but not for the reasons he should have been. I'm just being practical, Margaret continued. Love is wonderful, but it doesn't pay the bills. Alex has worked so hard to build his career, and he deserves someone who can match his ambition. Jessica giggled into her wine. Remember when Alex brought home that girl from college? What was her name? The one who worked at the campus bookstore? Mom practically had a heart attack. That was different, Alex said defensively. We were just kids then. And what's different now? Jessica asked, gesturing toward me. I mean, no offense, Natalie, but you're not exactly bringing much to the table, are you? The casual cruelty in her voice made my blood boil. In my real life, I employed 12 people, had revolutionized data processing for 3 major corporations, and owned property in 2 states. But here I sat, being lectured by a woman whose greatest achievement was spending her parents' money on designer handbags. Jessica, that's enough, Robert said suddenly, his voice sharp and strained. Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. He had been mostly silent throughout dinner, but now he looked genuinely distressed. Dad? Alex asked. Are you okay? Robert wiped his forehead with his napkin. I think we should be more welcoming to our guest. Margaret looked confused. We are being welcoming. We're just having an honest conversation about Alex's future. Honest? Robert's voice cracked slightly. Is that what we're calling this? I studied his face carefully. The recognition in his eyes was growing stronger, and with it came something that looked suspiciously like guilt. Robert, what's gotten into you? Margaret demanded. We're just looking out for our son. Are we? Robert asked quietly, then turned to me. Natalie, you said your father passed away? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but I could see it was important to him. Yes, when I was 16. What was his name? Margaret looked annoyed. Robert, why are you interrogating the poor girl about her dead father? But Robert ignored his wife. His eyes locked on mine. Please, what was your father's name? Something in his tone made my stomach clench. David Brooks. He was a businessman. Robert's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering against his plate. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood. Robert! Margaret shrieked, jumping up to avoid the spreading stain. I'm sorry, he whispered, but he wasn't looking at the mess. He was staring at me with an expression of pure horror. Dad, what's wrong? Jessica asked, suddenly concerned. Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to make a phone call. Excuse me. He practically ran from the room, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. Well, that was strange, Margaret said, dabbing at the wine stain with her napkin. I have no idea what's gotten into him. But I had a terrible feeling. I knew exactly what was wrong. My father had been a businessman, and he had trusted the wrong people. People who had stolen his ideas, his company, his future. People who had left him broken and defeated, leading to the stress that eventually killed him. Maybe I should go, I said quietly, my mind racing. Nonsense, Margaret said, though she didn't sound particularly sincere. Robert's just having one of his moods. Now, where were we? "Oh, yes, we were discussing your future with Alex." But I could barely focus on her words anymore. Through the dining room doorway, I could hear Robert's voice from the next room, urgent and hushed. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was upset, possibly even panicked. "The thing is, dear," Margaret continued, "Alex comes from a good family. We've worked hard to build our reputation, our standing in the community. We can't have that undermined by—" She trailed off, searching for a polite way to say what she really meant. "By someone like me?" I finished for her. "Well, yes," she said, looking relieved that I understood. "Nothing personal, of course." Nothing personal. As if destroying someone's dignity and self-worth could ever be anything but personal. Alex reached over and squeezed my hand. "Don't listen to them," he whispered, but his words felt hollow. If he really meant that, why wasn't he defending me more forcefully? From the next room, Robert's voice grew louder, more agitated. "I caught fragments. Can't be a coincidence. After all these years. What are we going to do?" Whatever Robert was discussing, it had everything to do with me. Robert returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, his face ashen and his hands visibly trembling. He sat down heavily in his chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. The confident businessman from earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd seen his worst nightmare come to life. "Everything all right, honey?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she was more annoyed by the interruption than concerned. "Fine," Robert muttered, but his voice was anything but fine. Margaret turned back to me with renewed energy, as if Robert's strange behavior had somehow validated her mission to tear me down. "Now, Natalie, I hope you understand that we're not trying to be cruel. We just want Alex to be realistic about his choices." "Realistic?" I repeated, tasting the word. Something about Robert's phone call had shifted my perspective entirely. The fear in his eyes, the way he'd reacted to my father's name, this wasn't just about testing Alex anymore. "Yes, realistic," Jessica chimed in. "I mean, look at the facts. You work part-time, you can barely afford decent clothes, and you have no family connections or resources. What exactly do you bring to this relationship? In my real life, I brought intelligence, success, financial security, and independence. But sitting here, watching these people tear apart someone they thought was vulnerable, I was learning something far more valuable about their character. "I bring love," I said simply. Margaret actually laughed. "Love doesn't pay for a house, dear. Love doesn't fund retirement accounts or pay for children's education. Alex needs a partner who can contribute practically to their future." "Like Amanda did?" I asked, my voice taking on a new edge. "Exactly like Amanda," Margaret said, missing my tone entirely. She understood what it meant to be part of a successful family. Robert suddenly looked up from his plate. "What did you say your mother's name was?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Margaret looked confused by her husband's continued fixation on my family history. "I didn't mention my mother," I said carefully. "But what was her name?" Robert pressed, his voice urgent. "Linda Brooks," I answered, watching his reaction closely. Robert's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands and made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a sob. "Robert, what on earth is wrong with you tonight?" Margaret demanded. "You're acting completely bizarre." But I was starting to understand. The pieces were falling into place in the most horrible way possible. My father's business partner, the man who had betrayed him and stolen everything, his name had been Thomas Mitchell. And if Robert Thompson knew my parents' names, if he was reacting this way to hearing about my father. "Did you know my father?" I asked quietly. Robert looked up at me with eyes full of guilt and terror. We should talk privately." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "If you knew my father, I want to hear about it here, in front of your family." Margaret looked back and forth between us, finally sensing that something serious was happening. "What's going on? Robert, how could you possibly know her father?" Alex was staring at his father with growing confusion. "Dad? What's this about?" Robert's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Thomas Mitchell," he whispered. The name hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Mitchell. The man who had destroyed my father's life, who had stolen his company and left him with nothing. The man whose betrayal had led to my father's death from stress and heartbreak. "You know Thomas Mitchell," I said, "and it wasn't a question." He's my business partner," Robert admitted, his voice barely audible. "My closest friend for over 20 years. The room went completely silent. Margaret's face showed dawning horror as she began to understand the implications. Jessica looked confused, but Alex was staring at his father with growing alarm. "Your business partner?" I repeated slowly. "The man who built your company, the man whose success allowed you to afford this house, this lifestyle, this dinner we're eating right now?" "Natalie, I don't understand," Alex said, but I could see in his eyes that he was starting to. I stood up slowly, my hands steady for the first time all evening. The scared, poor girl I had been pretending to be was gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. "Thomas Mitchell stole my father's company," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "He took everything my father had worked for, every idea, every innovation, every dream. He left my father with nothing but debt and shame." Robert was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know the whole story." "Didn't know?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Or didn't want to know?" Margaret's face had gone white. "Robert, what is she talking about?" But I wasn't done, not even close. "My father died of a heart attack when I was 16, I continued. "The doctor said it was stress. The stress of losing everything to a man he trusted." The silence in the dining room was deafening. Robert's tears had stopped, but his face remained buried in his hands. Margaret sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, finally understanding that her comfortable life had been built on someone else's destruction. Jessica looked between her parents and me, confusion slowly giving way to horror. But it was Alex's face that broke my heart. The man I had planned to marry was staring at me with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and dawning realization that everything he thought he knew was crumbling around him. "I don't understand," Alex said weakly. "Natalie, who are you really?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my real business card, the one with my actual title and company name. I placed it on the table next to my untouched dinner. "My name is Natalie Brooks," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm a senior software engineer and co-founder of Brooks Digital Solutions. I make $50,000 a month, not a year. I own a penthouse downtown, 3 cars, and enough stock options to buy this house 10 times over." Margaret's wine glass slipped from her fingers, joining the wreckage of Robert's earlier accident. "That's impossible," Jessica whispered. "You're wearing a $20 dress." "A $20 dress I bought specifically for tonight," I said, "because I wanted to see how your family would treat someone they thought was beneath them." Alex picked up my business card with shaking hands. "This is real?" "Google me," I said simply. Brooks Digital Solutions was featured on the cover of Tech Weekly last month. We just signed a $15 million contract with Morrison Industries. Robert finally looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "You're successful," he said, and it sounded like an accusation. "Despite what your friend Thomas Mitchell did to my family, yes, I'm successful." "Wait," Margaret said, her voice sharp with panic. "You said Thomas Mitchell stole from your father. But Robert's company, our money, it all came from legitimate business deals with Thomas." I laughed, but the sound was bitter. Legitimate. Thomas Mitchell built his empire on stolen intellectual property. Every algorithm, every software innovation, every breakthrough that made him rich, it all came from my father's work. Robert was shaking his head frantically. "I didn't know. Thomas told me he developed everything himself. He had patents, documentation. Forged documentation," I said. "My father was too trusting, too naive. He shared everything with his partner before protecting himself legally. When Thomas decided he wanted it all, there was nothing my father could do to prove the work was his." "This is insane," Jessica said. "You're making this up." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo I kept in my private album, one of the few pictures I had of my father in his office. Standing next to the whiteboard, where he'd sketched out the algorithms that would later make Thomas Mitchell millions. This was taken 6 months before Thomas filed the patents under his own name, I said, showing them the photo. "Notice the date stamp." Alex stared at the photo, then at me. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Because I wanted to know who you really were, I said. I wanted to know if you would love me when you thought I had nothing, if you would defend me when your family attacked me, if you were the kind of man who could see past money to the person underneath. And, Alex asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. You failed, I said simply. You sat here for 2 hours while your mother and sister tore me apart, and you said nothing. You were embarrassed by me, ashamed of me, ready to let them convince you I wasn't good enough. Margaret suddenly came alive, her survival instincts kicking in. Now wait just a minute, she said, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet tone. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We weren't attacking you, dear. We were just testing you. Yes, that's it. We wanted to see if you were strong enough for our Alex. Testing me? I repeated incredulously. Of course. Jessica jumped in, deleting something frantically on her phone, probably the photos she'd taken of me earlier. We do this with all of Alex's girlfriends. It's like a family tradition. The desperation in their voices was almost pathetic. Now that they knew I had money, now that they understood I wasn't the helpless victim they thought they could abuse, they were scrambling to rewrite history. You're lying, I said flatly. Robert looked up at me with pleading eyes. Natalie, please, if I had known about your father, about what Thomas did— You would have what? I interrupted. Given back the money? Refused to profit from stolen work? Or would you have just felt slightly guilty while continuing to enjoy the benefits? He had no answer for that. Alex reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Natalie, please. We can work through this. My family made mistakes tonight, but— Mistakes? I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Alex, your family spent the entire evening trying to destroy someone they thought was vulnerable and defenseless. The only mistake they made was picking the wrong target. I stood at the head of the Thompson family's dining table, looking down at the people who had spent the evening trying to crush what they thought was a defenseless woman. The irony was almost too perfect. Here they were, scrambling to salvage a situation they had created through their own cruelty and greed. Please! Natalie, Margaret said, her voice now honey-sweet where it had been venomous before. You have to understand, we were just being protective of Alex. Any mother would do the same. Any mother would humiliate and degrade their son's girlfriend? I asked. Any mother would spend 2 hours explaining why someone isn't good enough for their family? We didn't mean it that way, Jessica said quickly, her phone now completely hidden. We were just getting to know you. I looked at Alex, who was still holding my business card like it might disappear if he let go. And you? What's your excuse? I don't know, he admitted. I guess I thought they would warm up to you eventually. They can be difficult at first, but— Difficult? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Alex, your mother spent 20 minutes explaining why I wasn't worthy of breathing the same air as your ex-girlfriend. Your sister took photos of me to mock with her friends, and you sat there. You sat there and let it happen. I tried to stop them, he protested weakly. No, you didn't. You made a few half-hearted comments and then went back to your dinner. You were embarrassed by me, weren't you? Embarrassed by my cheap dress, my fake poverty, my supposed lack of education and connections. Alex's silence was answer enough. Robert finally found his voice. Natalie, about your father, about Thomas, I swear I didn't know the full story. Thomas told me he had developed everything himself. If I had known— If you had known, you would have done exactly what you did, I said. You would have taken the money and convinced yourself it was legitimate because it was easier than asking hard questions. That's not fair, Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Fair? I turned to face him fully. My father worked 18-hour days for 3 years, developing the software that made Thomas Mitchell rich. He trusted his partner, shared everything with him, treated him like family. And Thomas repaid that trust by stealing everything and leaving my father with nothing. But you're successful now, Margaret said desperately. You've overcome all of that. You're wealthy, you're accomplished. Surely you can forgive and forget? Forgive and forget? I stared at her in disbelief. My father died believing he was a failure. He died thinking he had let his family down, that he wasn't smart enough or strong enough to protect what he had built. He never knew that I would succeed, despite what Thomas did to him. I reached into my purse and pulled out my engagement ring, the modest diamond Alex had saved for months to buy, back when he thought he was proposing to a struggling receptionist. I built my success on my own, I continued, placing the ring on the table next to my business card. Every line of code, every client meeting, every sleepless night, working to prove myself in an industry that didn't want women like me. I did it all while carrying the weight of my father's stolen dreams. "Natalie, don't do this," Alex pleaded. "We can work through this. My family will apologize. They'll make things right." Make things right. I looked around the table at their desperate faces. How exactly would they do that, Alex? Your family's entire lifestyle is built on my father's stolen work. This house, your education, Jessica's designer clothes, your mother's jewelry, all of it paid for with money that should have been ours. We could pay you back, Robert said frantically. Whatever Thomas owes your family, we could. You think this is about money? I asked. You think I came here tonight looking for a payout? Then what do you want? Margaret asked. I looked at each of them in turn. Robert with his guilt and fear, Margaret with her desperate attempts to salvage the situation, Jessica with her confusion and growing panic, and Alex with his heartbreak and betrayal. I wanted to know who you really were, I said simply. I wanted to know if the man I loved would stand by me when I had nothing. I wanted to know if his family had the kind of character that could accept someone they thought was beneath them. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. And now I know, I said without turning around. You're exactly the kind of people who would profit from stolen dreams and then spend their evening destroying someone they thought couldn't fight back. I paused at the doorway and looked back one last time. The difference between us is that when I had nothing, I built something. When you thought I had nothing, you tried to take away what little dignity you thought I had left. I walked out of the Thompson house and into the night, leaving behind the engagement ring, the fake life I had created, and the man who had shown me exactly who he was when it mattered most. My real car was waiting around the corner, a sleek BMW that cost more than Alex made in a year. As I drove back to my penthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete freedom. I was finally free to be myself again.